If someone has ever said these phrases to you, "That never happened," "You're too sensitive," or "You're imagining things," I need you to listen carefully, because that wasn't a misunderstanding. That wasn't poor communication, that was gaslighting. And the most dangerous part about gaslighting isn't the manipulation itself. It's the moment when you start doubting your own memory, your own emotions, and eventually, your own reality. In this video, we're breaking down 7 phrases gaslighters use, explaining why they work psychologically, and, most importantly, showing you how to protect yourself before the damage becomes permanent. Gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation where someone deliberately causes another person to question their perception of reality. Not their opinion, not their feelings, but reality itself. The term comes from the 1944 film Gaslight, where a husband subtly manipulates his wife by dimming the gas lights in their home and then insisting she's imagining it. Over time, she begins to believe she's losing her mind. That's the core of gaslighting. Deny reality, repeat the denial, and watch the victim internalize it. Unlike physical abuse, gaslighting leaves no visible scars, only confusion, anxiety, and deep self-doubt. Gaslighting is so effective because humans rely on shared reality to feel safe. When someone you trust repeatedly contradicts your experiences, your brain tries to resolve that conflict by assuming you must be wrong. Over time, you stop trusting your memory, you stop voicing concerns, and you start asking for permission to feel. That's when control becomes complete. One of the most common gaslighting phrases is "that never happened." This is the foundation of gaslighting. You remember a conversation, a promise, or a boundary that was crossed, and they look at you and say it never happened, not "I don't remember," not "I see it differently." Just total erasure. This isn't debate, it's reality deletion. It works because memory isn't perfect, and gaslighters exploit that uncertainty. The more confident they sound, the more you second-guess yourself. Over time, you stop trusting your own recollection and begin relying on them to tell you what's real. Another phrase that shows up constantly is "you're too sensitive." This doesn't deny the event. It reframes the problem as your emotions. Instead of addressing what they did, they shift the focus onto how you reacted. What they're really saying is that your feelings are inconvenient. This works because most people don't want to be seen as emotional or weak, so you start suppressing valid reactions just to avoid the label. Over time, you minimize your own pain, and that creates emotional numbness. Then there's "you're crazy" or "you're imagining things." This is one of the most aggressive gaslighting tactics because it attacks your sanity directly. The implication is that you can't trust your own mind. Humans fear being perceived as unstable, and once that doubt enters your self-image, you begin self-censoring, apologizing unnecessarily, and shrinking yourself to avoid conflict. Anyone who casually questions your sanity during a disagreement isn't trying to resolve anything, they're trying to dominate. Another subtle but powerful phrase is, "you're remembering it wrong." It sounds calm, reasonable, even helpful, but it carries the same message. Your brain is unreliable, and theirs isn't. Repeated often enough, it trains you to defer to their version of events even when your instincts tell you otherwise. Eventually, you stop advocating for yourself because you assume you might be wrong. Gaslighters also use social pressure with phrases like, "everyone else thinks you're wrong." This is social gaslighting. They invoke an imaginary consensus to isolate you, implying that friends, family, or co-workers all agree with them. Humans are wired for belonging, and the idea that everyone disagrees with you creates shame and fear of rejection. A key reality check here is simple. If everyone thinks you're wrong, why is this person the only one telling you? Another classic line is, "I was just joking, can't you take a joke?" This reframes harm as humor. If you react, you're accused of being dramatic, sensitive, or ruining the mood. It puts you in a no-win situation, either accept the insult or be labeled difficult. But jokes don't require emotional cleanup. If it hurt, it wasn't a joke. It was disguised aggression. Finally, there's "you're being dramatic." This dismisses both your emotions and the seriousness of the situation. It suggests the problem isn't the behavior, it's your reaction. Over time, you start minimizing serious issues because you don't want to be seen as dramatic, and that leads you to tolerate behavior you never should have. Psychologically, gaslighting works by creating cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of holding two conflicting beliefs. You experience something, and they insist it didn't happen. To resolve that discomfort, the brain often chooses the option that preserves the relationship, even if it means abandoning self-trust. Over time, this leads to hypervigilance, chronic self-doubt, and emotional dependence. The effects on victims can be severe. Long-term gaslighting often results in anxiety, depression, loss of confidence, difficulty making decisions, emotional numbness, and isolation. Many victims say, the hardest part isn't the abuse itself, it's learning how to trust themselves again. Gaslighting appears in many contexts. In romantic relationships, partners rewrite history, deny promises, and dismiss emotional needs. In the workplace, managers deny conversations, shift blame, and undermine competence. In families, parents minimize abuse, rewrite childhood memories, and guilt children into silence. Gaslighting doesn't require cruelty, only control. Protecting yourself starts with documentation. Write things down, save messages, track patterns. One incident can be confusing, but repetition is manipulation. Stop arguing about reality. Gaslighters don't want understanding, they want power. Seek outside perspective from trusted friends or professionals. Set firm boundaries. You don't need permission to trust yourself. One of the most overlooked dangers of gaslighting is how slowly it rewires your inner dialogue. At first, the manipulation feels external, someone contradicting you, dismissing you, or reframing events. But over time, their voice becomes internal. You start questioning yourself before anyone else can. You rehearse explanations in your head. You soften your language. You pre-apologize. Eventually, the gaslighter doesn't even need to be present anymore. You do their work for them. This is why gaslighting is so corrosive. It teaches you to betray your own instincts. Many victims describe a moment when they realized something was wrong, not because of a single incident, but because of exhaustion. The constant mental effort of tracking what was said, what was denied, and what version of events was currently acceptable becomes overwhelming. You feel like you're walking on unstable ground, where reality shifts depending on someone else's mood. That instability creates anxiety. Not because you're fragile, but because the human brain is not designed to function without a reliable sense of truth. Gaslighters often present themselves as calm, logical, and rational, especially when you're emotional. This contrast is intentional. When someone stays unnervingly composed while you're upset, it creates the illusion that they're reasonable and you're not. But emotional responses don't invalidate truth. In fact, emotions are often signals that a boundary has been crossed. Gaslighting trains you to distrust those signals, which makes you easier to control. Another critical detail people miss is that gaslighting rarely happens in isolation. It's usually paired with intermittent validation. One moment, the person undermines you. Next, they're kind, affectionate, or supportive. This inconsistency strengthens emotional dependence because your brain starts chasing relief. You don't leave because you remember the good version of them and assume that if you just communicate better or react differently, things will go back to that phase. This is not misunderstanding, it's conditioning. In workplaces, gaslighting is often disguised as professionalism. A manager denies giving instructions, shifts blame onto you, or reframes your concerns as incompetence. Over time, you start documenting everything, not because you're paranoid, but because your lived experience keeps getting erased. Victims of workplace gaslighting often leave jobs believing they're incapable, only to thrive elsewhere once the manipulation is removed. That alone should tell you where the problem was. In families, gaslighting can be even harder to identify because it's normalized. Phrases like, "that's not how it happened," or "you're exaggerating your childhood," are often framed as perspective differences. But when your pain is consistently minimized or rewritten, it teaches you that your emotional reality doesn't matter. Adult children who were gaslit growing up often struggle with decision-making, self-worth, and chronic guilt, not because they're broken, but because their internal compass was repeatedly sabotaged. Romantic gaslighting carries its own unique damage. When a partner denies cheating, dismisses broken promises, or accuses you of being controlling for asking basic questions, you begin to feel unsafe expressing needs. Eventually, you stop asking. You accept less. You convince yourself that love means endurance. But love does not require self-erasure. One of the most painful realizations for survivors is recognizing how much time they spent trying to explain themselves. Gaslighters thrive on explanation because it keeps you engaged in defending reality instead of protecting yourself. Healthy people don't need you to justify your perception over and over. When someone repeatedly invalidates you, clarity doesn't come from better arguments. It comes from distance. Healing from gaslighting begins with rebuilding trust in yourself. This often feels uncomfortable at first because self-trust was punished in the past. You might doubt your judgments or fear being wrong. That's normal. Start small. Notice patterns instead of isolated incidents. Ask yourself how you feel after interactions, not just what was said. Your body often recognizes manipulation before your mind does. Writing things down can be powerful, not as proof for others, but as confirmation for yourself. Seeing patterns on paper helps counter the fog that gaslighting creates. So does hearing your story reflected back by someone safe. Gaslighting loses power when it's exposed to witnesses. Boundaries are essential, but they often trigger backlash from gaslighters. When you stop explaining, stop over-apologizing, or stop accepting blame, the manipulation may intensify. This isn't a sign that you're wrong, it's a sign that the strategy is failing. Resistance doesn't create abuse, it reveals it. Some people struggle with guilt after recognizing gaslighting, especially if the manipulator is a parent, partner, or authority figure. But acknowledging harm is not betrayal. It's honesty. You are allowed to name what happened without vilifying yourself or excusing others. Seeking professional support is not weakness. It's recalibration. Therapists help restore your sense of reality by validating experiences without rewriting them. That validation can feel almost shocking if you've been gaslit for years. Many survivors describe the first moment of being believed as emotionally overwhelming, not because they were fragile, but because they had been doubting themselves for so long. If you're watching this and questioning whether what you experienced counts, that question alone is a red flag. Healthy relationships don't make you question your sanity. They don't require you to constantly prove your feelings are justified. They don't punish you for noticing inconsistencies. Gaslighting doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's polite, sometimes it hides behind humor, intellect, or concern. But its impact is always the same. It disconnects you from yourself. Reclaiming that connection is an act of courage. You are not overreacting. You are not imagining things. And you are not difficult for wanting clarity. Reality does not need consensus to be real. Your experiences are valid because you lived them. If this continuation helped you put language to something you've been carrying, consider sharing it with someone who might still be stuck in the fog. And if you want more content that breaks down manipulation, emotional abuse, and psychological control without sugarcoating it, make sure you're subscribed. The more clearly you can see, the harder it becomes for anyone to rewrite your reality. What makes gaslighting especially dangerous is that it doesn't just distort your view of the present. It reshapes how you interpret your past. Moments you once felt sure about start feeling hazy. Memories lose their emotional weight. You begin to wonder whether events that hurt you were actually significant, or if you simply misread them. This retroactive doubt is one of the deepest scars gaslighting leaves behind, because it robs you of the ability to trust your own history. Over time, this erosion creates a version of you that is quieter, more cautious, and far less expressive. Not because you suddenly changed, but because your expression became unsafe. You learned that speaking up led to denial, ridicule, or punishment. Silence felt easier. Compliance felt protective. The tragedy is that from the outside, this looks like growth or maturity, when in reality, it's survival. Gaslighters often claim they want peace, but what they actually want is control. Peace requires mutual respect and accountability. Control requires confusion. That's why conversations with gaslighters often go in circles. You're discussing one issue, and suddenly you're defending your tone, your memory, or your character. The original concern disappears, replaced by a trial where you're the defendant. This isn't accidental, it's strategic. One of the hardest steps in recovery is accepting that the person who gaslit you may never acknowledge what they did. Many survivors stay stuck waiting for an apology, an admission, or a moment of clarity that never comes. Closure doesn't always arrive as understanding from the other person. Often, it arrives as permission you give yourself to stop seeking validation from someone who benefited from denying it. Reclaiming your voice doesn't mean becoming aggressive or confrontational. Sometimes it simply means trusting your internal no again. It means walking away from conversations that feel circular. It means choosing not to explain yourself to people who consistently misunderstand you. This can feel uncomfortable, even selfish at first, especially if you were conditioned to prioritize harmony over honesty. Healing also involves grieving the version of yourself that existed before the manipulation. That grief is real. You lost time, energy, and trust. Allowing yourself to feel that loss doesn't make you bitter. It makes you honest. From that honesty, clarity grows. If you're still in a gaslighting situation, remember this. Confusion is not a personal failure. It's a predictable response to psychological manipulation. The moment you begin questioning the dynamic instead of yourself, the power begins to shift. Awareness doesn't fix everything overnight, but it gives you something gaslighting tries to steal: perspective. You deserve relationships where reality isn't debated, where your emotions aren't mocked, and where your memory doesn't need a defense attorney. And the more you internalize that truth, the harder it becomes for anyone to convince you otherwise. If gaslighting has caused panic attacks, dissociation, fear of speaking up, or a loss of identity, professional help is essential. This damage is real, and it is reversible. Gaslighting doesn't mean you're weak. It means someone exploited your trust. Recognizing it isn't betrayal. It's self-respect. If this video helped you name something you couldn't explain, share it with someone who might need it. And if you want more deep dives into psychological manipulation, emotional abuse, and self-protection strategies, subscribe to the channel. Because clarity is power, and nobody gets to rewrite your reality.